and welcome to the second edition of the Beltway Buzz. I'm Alex Dunn, and I'm joined here with my colleagues, Nadira Clark and Ann Carpenter.
Hello, Happy New Year.
We're so happy to have you here for our second edition.
We are bringing you today's water cooler style discussion to talk about something that we in the Beltway are quite interested in, which is what is going to be happening in the 118th Congress. And boy, have we already seen some interesting things. To help us with this discussion, we are really excited to welcome to our conversation Jeff Berkowitz. Jeff, welcome. Jeff is the founder and Jeff's the founder and CEO of Delve. Delve is a company that helps heavily regulated and highly scrutinized sectors, including energy and utilities, anticipate and mitigate political and reputational risks. Jeff has a really interesting background. He served as the research director for the RNC. He served 3 tours under 4 chairmen across 5 election cycles, and he worked on the staff of or advised 5 major presidential campaigns. Jeff, you actually don't look old enough to have accomplished all that.
Thank you.
But he's also managed research and messaging operations at the White House, the State Department, and several prominent private sector and nonprofit organizations. So clearly, Jeff is a man in the know, and we are glad to have him here. Jeff, tell us a little bit about Delve and what you all do.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on to talk about some of these great issues today. Delve is really a competitive intelligence company and risk advisory firm that looks at the trajectory of policy through the lens of public affairs. Who are all the different stakeholders that are going to engage in the different policy, regulatory, and approval processes that folks in heavily regulated industries have to navigate, particularly energy, which is one of our largest practices. We work across that energy value chain with both traditional and renewable folks, and really make sure they understand, have that information advantage to navigate these things and get projects built and keep their companies operating.
Great. Well, Jeff, with that background, that is certainly helpful context. And since we have certainly started off the 118th Congress in a pretty unusual way, with 15 votes to elect the new speaker, now that we've landed on a speaker, can you give us a sense of who the key players are going to be in environmental and energy, and really front runners that are vying for leadership positions on energy or environmental committees?
Yeah, and to a large extent, this is set now. As we speak. There isn't a huge change in some of the folks that have been in leadership roles from past Congresses. Kathy, there's going to be some seat changes. Kathy McMorris Rodgers gets to sit at the chair's seat on the Energy and Commerce Committee, while Frank Pallone has to move to the ranking member. So you get to see who you're going to change who's grumpy about what's happening and who's got more control of the gavel. T&I, transportation and infrastructure. I mean, that's where you are going to see. We'll see if it's a substantive change, but Sam Graves is moving from ranking member to chair, and Peter DeFazio is retired after decades in Congress and is a real transportation leader. Rick Larson, also from Oregon, is going to take his seat as ranking member. But he's been on the committee since 2001, so I don't know that that's going to be a huge change. They both have a big aviation focus, Graves and him. EPW, Senate EPW, Tom Carper is going to continue as chair. Shelley Moore Capito is going to stay as ranking member. Senator Manchin is going to continue to be a thorn in the administration's side at Energy Committee over in the Senate, and Senator Barrasso is continuing there. I would note the House Natural Resources Committee, I think, is going to be an interesting one to watch. Bruce Westerman was a big Only Kevin supporter. He was very vocal. If you were the C-SPAN junkie that I am, you saw him on the floor in the thick of a lot of the discussions to get him through those 15 votes. He's going to chair the Natural Resources Committee, and he's a Yale-educated forester. So I think that he's going to play some interesting roles in some of these energy and environmental issues in the House. And I also think the Science Committee, Frank Lucas, is that, if you look at the agenda that the House Republicans put together and advance the election, the Science Committee has some key roles in some of the innovation in the energy space. So that'll be an interesting one to watch as well.
Great. So Jeff, what are some of the priority issues you expect to see from this Congress, particularly with respect to energy and the environment?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the happy side first,
Okay.
which is, I just mentioned that they put together an energy and climate agenda in advance of the election. You had Republican task force in the House led by Garrett Graves, who was the ranking member on the Select Committee on Climate Change. We'll see where he lands as a role in the new Congress's. Speaker McCarthy will not be keeping that committee around. But they had an energy, climate, and conservation task force that laid out 6 pillars that they really want. And I think that's going to drive the agenda. It's unlocking American resources. So it's how do we get back to that energy dominance and oil and gas production and investment that we saw in the prior administration? How do we get projects built more quickly? Permitting reform and the other things that stand in the way of getting projects built. Innovation, we have led the world over the last 20 to 30 years in emissions reductions, even though we aren't doing it with Paris Climate or Kyoto or the rest of these agreements. We're doing it with innovation. And you see a lot of that in the oil and gas space. And I think that you're going to see this, a lot of efforts put forward by the House to continue that. There's a big focus. They're framing it as how we beat China and Russia, but it's really focused on the financial sector. And is capital being allocated according to the needs of the marketplace? Is growing oil and gas production, or is it going to more politically favored places like clean energy and climate change issues? There's going to be a huge scrutiny of ESG commitments, both on the company side as well as the financial institution side in this Congress. And then some conservation members and building resilience, wildfires and water and some of those other issues are in there as well. So that's the positive agenda that you'll see happen in the House. But realistically, these are messaging bills. Nothing that they do in the House is likely to pass the Senate. There may be a few opportunities here or there from some negotiations, but really what we're doing is setting the landscape for what happens in 2025 in the hopes that there's a Republican president and a Republican Senate that the House can work with to pass some of these things. So this is an important part to shape some of these debates early on, but the real focus of action is going to be investigations of the administration. And what you're going to need to be careful about is how does that hit companies and industries, because there's going to be, they're going to be hunting for the next Solyndra.
Okay.
Well, and Jeff, as we've talked about the Congress in preparation for today, you had mentioned that we're going to be going back to regular order. And I remember you saying that there's an entire generation of folks who've worked in Washington that don't even know what regular order is.
Indeed.
So for those who may be naive and not know, what does it mean when we go back to regular order? What does it mean for the committees and for the way we're used to seeing legislation get passed?
Yeah. So if you go back to the 70s, you have Schoolhouse Rocks, how a bill becomes a law, right? Somebody proposes it, it goes into a committee, there's hearings and discussion, then they refine it and move it to the floor, and then the floor they debate. They have the great debates of the day and amendments, and then it moves to the other chamber, and then they come together in a conference committee. And this is regular order. This is the way the rules are written and the way it's supposed to work. And it hasn't happened in 20 years. What happens is what are called the four corners: the speaker, the opposition party leader in the House, as well as the Senate Majority Leader and Senate Minority Leader come together and make decisions and sort of hash things out in that Speaker's office and the Senate Majority Leader's office. and maybe sometimes the White House gets brought in too. And it has very little to do with what the committees have put forward. And I think Kevin McCarthy, both because of the commitments he made ahead of the 15 votes and how he wanted the House to run, he built out these task force on all these different issues and had more than dozens of members involved in these processes to build out bills and everything. He has a couple key priorities, but other than that, I think he really plans on letting the chairs run the show on a lot of these things. Where that's going to get complicated for him is on appropriations bills. There are 12 appropriations bills, and for a very long time, you haven't seen very many of those passed before the fiscal year starts, October 1. And that's, that means he's going to have to figure out how to thread the needle through the Freedom Caucus and some of the other folks to get those spending bills passed, which is going to be interesting.
Okay. Well, talking about legislation being made, and thanks Schoolhouse Rock, I appreciate that from my youth.
Foundational part of my education.
Exactly. We have read, though, that in past reports that you've put out, that historically the bipartisan split Congresses have been actually able to overcome some of this gridlock and pass historic legislation. And I think we would really be interested in knowing from you for this 118th Congress, do you see negotiation and compromise, and where might that be? I know you talked about a couple things, the happy thoughts, ESG and other things, but do you see it there? Do you see really gridlock, which I think many Americans and businesses are somewhat anxious about?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The perception is, Republicans are going to be intransigent and you're going to have this gridlock in Washington, and, the president's going to turn to the phone and pen to pass executive orders, and then people that don't like those executive orders will sue and nothing will happen. And there will be a lot of that, but it's not going to be entire gridlock. We did an analysis. We actually originally did the analysis after the 2018 elections when the Democrats were taking over the House, and obviously Donald Trump was president, and it was going to be an interesting dynamic. Similarly here, if you look historically, split Congress doesn't necessarily mean gridlock. You look at 1990, after the 1994 election, President Clinton signed historic welfare reform, major telecommunications deregulation, HIPAA, which is such the Health Insurance Portability and Privacy Act. I mean, that was a huge thing. 2013, you had a Republican House, Democratic Senate, Democratic president. Sounds very similar here. You had a long stalled farm bill. We're about to have another farm bill in this Congress, and you got some very significant reforms to the National Flood Insurance Program. So you just as a few examples, even after the 2018 election, when there's such hatred between Democrats and Trump, you got USMCA implementation legislation through, and you got the CARES Act and all the other responses to COVID. So things can happen. That's the good news. The bad news is, for the most part, that only happens after there's a major shutdown of the government.
So we have to prepare ourselves, is what you're saying.
And if I would be the thing that would be keeping me up at night if I care about my stock portfolio right now would be, the Treasury Secretary just informed Speaker McCarthy over the weekend that we are about to reach the debt ceiling, and they'll take emergency measures, and that may get us a few weeks, or depending on how collections come in, maybe even a few months, revenue collections come in. But sometime this spring or maybe summer, we're going to hit that debt ceiling, and Congress is going to have to act. And that is going to be very difficult. You have the same 10 to 20 members that thought they could change the result of the speaker election, that think they can stand athwart history and say no to the debt ceiling going up. And they're going to want some concessions. And what does that end up? But you've got Democrats in the Senate saying no. So this is going to be an interesting game of chicken that we watch. But they're going to get past it. We always do. And the question is, what does that look like? And then there's a lot of opportunities for bipartisan action once they get through that fight.
Well, to follow up on that and to focus on the positive, what are those areas for bipartisan agreement and cooperation? What can we expect there?
So, I think particularly looking at for this audience, the environmental regulation and energy transition space, I think there's still more action that could be happening on carbon capture and storage. These hydrogen. I think there's bipartisan backers in Congress, despite there being a lot of opposition from environmental activists. And there's some opportunities to do more to advance what the IRA started. There could also be some interesting opportunities on biofuels and oversight of the renewable fuel standard. As I'm sure you guys know, EPA came out with their new RFS proposal for the next few years this past fall, and surprised some folks by saying that electric vehicles could have RINs. They could be a part of that program. That's a huge complication. So Congress may want to weigh in on that in some ways. And there is a potential for permitting reform to happen. The Republicans wanted to get a better deal than they felt they were going to get in the fall, and I think they had legitimate concerns. If you talk to folks that follow this issue closely, like FERC Commissioner Danley or others, they've made it very clear, if you really don't address NEPA timelines and you don't address the water rules that allow the states to weigh in on permits and some of these other pieces of the puzzle in a meaningful way, you're not getting real permitting reform. And so maybe there's an opportunity for there to be a deal, and we'll have to see.
Just thinking about how this all unfolds with major legislation, I'm thinking about the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and there's that statute is just enormous, full of grant programs and opportunities for everyone, and a lot falling on the EPA. So can we talk a little bit, Jeff, about how major federal agencies are working with Congress to implement some of the seminal legislation of the last Congress, and kind of what you see from those federal agencies, particularly maybe with the IRA?
Yeah. So, even before you get to the IRA, the federal government is still trying to do the implementation of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act.
Oh, right, the IIJA.
IIJA, which was a year earlier. And so they're just starting to get rolling on IRA. I know, this administration has a lot of folks in it that they know how to put together these rules, and they're going to be very methodical on it. And they want to make sure that they can withstand scrutiny and litigation. One of the interesting early trends we've been seeing in some of the IRA rules is some of the constrictions that Congress put in, like American-made content rules for EVs and battery technology, are getting creatively interpreted by agencies. If I think that's a polite way to put it, to try and open up opportunities. And so it'll be interesting to see how some of that plays out. But the reality is it's going to take years for this money to actually hit the street. But the bigger challenge is then what, right? It's great to get these grants, to get this money, but you still have to get the approvals. You still have to get the permits. You still have to engage all those state and local policymakers and stakeholders and make sure that they support the project to get things built. We're going to be seeing these things play out over a number of years.
So when it comes to companies that are trying to be part of this playing space with the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, what can companies expect to see out there on the landscape? Yeah.
So I would go even further and instead of just sort of waiting and seeing, engage in the processes, because how these rules are shaped and who shapes them will impact how useful they are to industry and to companies. And so making sure that you have a voice with agencies is going to be crucial in helping them understand how to write these things in ways that they can actually be used, right? Some of the hydrogen incentives sound great, and they bumped up some of those tax credits a lot, but then there's these big asterisks where actually they reduce the credit significantly. And then you get bonuses if you have an apprenticeship program, if you're paying prevailing wages, if you're you're using American-made materials. Some of these things have varying level of reality behind them, and how realistic they are that you can actually get American-made pieces of the puzzle on some of these rare earth minerals and metals and other things. They also have, and also if you're paying prevailing wages, how much more is that costing you to build the project, and how much is that tax credit boost offsetting it? So I think helping the administration, the different agencies understand, how these things are shaped is going to be crucial, and also making sure the rulemakings are being done correctly, because otherwise these things end up in court. Those of us who have been especially at law firms in Washington, are very familiar with regulatory ping pong that gets played here, where whichever side gets the statute right and the regulations right, cheers it, and the other side files lawsuits, and then it all goes into court, and then it gets bounced back, and then there's a change in administration or change in Congress, and it leaves companies without the confidence and stability that they need to actually make these longer term investments.
So that's such a great point, and I want to follow up on it a little bit, because EPA is such a driving force in the environmental and regulatory landscape. It's promulgating regulations and it's implementing them. And as you said, that often plays out in the courts. But, the agencies do have a certain amount of deference to do that. And as you said, sometimes that might be creative. And so would love to hear from you about what kind of agency oversight have we typically seen more recently, from the last Congress, and what do you think we're going to see with this Congress overseeing some of those agency actions on the EPA side?
Yeah, I think the EPA administrator's dry cleaning budget's going to go way up, because he's going to spending a lot of time in front of congressional oversight hearings. They have been spent the last 2 years pushing forward, their version of rolling back Trump rules, bringing forward new versions of many of the things that the Obama administration had put forward. You're going to see a lot of congressional oversight. WOTUS, the Waters of the United States, is going to be a big piece of that. You're gonna see a lot of scrutiny on the money. EPA, I mean, the IRA, close to doubles the EPA's budget. I mean, they've never undertaken a grant program of this size. With all of these kinds of things, and you've already seen examples of some of the press, particularly the conservative press, catching grant announcements for companies that are using Chinese technologies or other things. That's going to be this Congress is there. The House is setting up an entire select committee on the China threat. They are going to be very focused on where our national security is being implicated in supply chain, and energy is on the front line of a lot of those questions, because right now the reality is they're really the only ones refining the rare earths, even if they're being mined elsewhere.
And it does sound like that can very quickly roll down to our clients as well. If that oversight is on the congressional side, that's gonna real quickly roll down to the recipients. So.
Absolutely. They may be aiming at the administration, but they're going to hit a lot of company and industry targets. And it can undermine programs that are valuable and useful for industry. I mean, I think we've seen, the folks that are leading the energy transition in reality are a lot of the folks that are supposedly the energy transition is taking us away from, because who knows how to build and engineer large infrastructure projects. It's the oil and gas folks, it's the utility folks. They know how to navigate these things, and they're the ones who have been innovating what can actually be done, because legislation can only take you as far as physics can. Despite some of our friends in various legislatures' best efforts.
Well, I know we're coming into the home stretch, but while we're discussing, influential agencies, we've talked a lot about EPA here today. I think it's important when we're talking about energy issues in the 118th Congress to talk about the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. So just to go back a little bit, at the end of last year's session, Chairman Richard Glick's term ended after Senator Joe Manchin, chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, declined to hold a renomination hearing. And in early January, President Biden named Democrat Willie Phillips as acting chairman, and while a replacement is found. So how will this affect FERC? What will it be?
Well, look, we already talked about companies need reliability, they need consistency, they need stability, and FERC isn't really providing that right now. You have an acting chair, you have an empty seat on the commission, you have one commissioner whose term ends on June 30th, Commissioner Danley. So the question is, is this an audition for Willie Phillips to be the permanent chair? Is the administration looking for somebody to bring in from the outside? Are they trying to see if they could potentially bring Clements in? It was seen as a more sort of environmentalist friendly commissioner than Commissioner Phillips. In his chair as the permanent chair. Are they going to pair a Democrat with Danley's renomination? Does Danley want to be renominated? Mm-hmm. There's all of these questions, and you've got a 2-2 commission, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats until that happens, which means you're going to have a number of the more controversial things that are just going to get deadlocked. And we'll see how that all plays out. The Manchin and Barrasso made very clear they didn't like some of the attempted policy changes, particularly on pipelines, in terms of evaluating up and downstream greenhouse gas emissions and some of the other things that Chairman Glick tried to accomplish. But I think one of the things that I would be watching is beneath the surface at the staff level. One of, I think, the lasting legacies of Chairman Glick is he stood up the Office of Public Participation, which has been in the statutes since FERC was created, but never actually stood up and implemented. And they are using the office to find opportunities to provide federal government funding to local interveners that otherwise couldn't intervene in some of these cases. But in reality, a lot of that money is going to end up at Earth Justice and NRDC and a lot of these other places that are every bit as fancy, and sharp, thinking lawyers as you guys have at Baker Botts, but they get to cloak themselves as nonprofits. And how that money goes out the door into which interveners can really disrupt projects. And it means our taxpayer dollars are going to slow the very energy infrastructure we need to meet our energy needs across the country.
Jeff, you've taken us right to the top of the hour with a really profound statement. So, what I'm hearing is we all need to really be eyes wide open as we go into this new Congress. And I just want to thank you for joining us at our virtual water cooler.
Thank you
for this chat. It's been really enlightening, and I want to thank everyone who joined us online. It really was a pleasure having Jeff from Delve with us, and I learned a lot.
I'm a little concerned about what lies ahead. I'm a little preoccupied now, thanks to you, but appreciate it nonetheless.
It might be a rough road for a little while.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm usually better right before happy hour.
Okay. We'll remember that.
All right. Well, it's still early here, but it's 5 o'clock somewhere. With that, I just want to thank everyone for being a part of the Beltway Buzz from Baker Botts. Stay tuned for our next episode, which will be later this spring. We are going to be focused on enforcement trends with a fantastic guest, Susan Bodine, who has a long history working as a congressional staff member, House and Senate, and also in two administrations. So we're really excited about that. And with that, we'll wrap today's episode of The Buzz.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.